After spending more than 100 hours with Where Winds Meet, I've reached a realization that it is uncomfortable for many Western AAA studios. The game represents the kind of ambition and design philosophy that Western development used to be known for, but gradually stepped away from. And it's emerging from a place Western studios did not expect, delivered through a free-to-play model built on systems that encourage creativity rather than restrict it, and released at a moment where Western development studios are struggling with identity, cost, and most importantly of all, player trust. What makes Where Winds Meet alarming for publishers in North America and Europe isn't that it outperforms any particular game or that it belongs to some rival cultural bloc. What worries them is the way it reframes expectations. It shows players an open world RPG that feels mechanically expressive, visually ambitious, and refreshingly unconstrained. While much of the Western AAA landscape has been leaning increasingly towards safer formulas and more predictable design patterns. And once players are exposed to that difference, it becomes difficult for the old formulas to retain their authority. To understand why Where Winds Meet stands out, it helps to recognize the position Western AAA development has slowly backed itself into. Over the past decade, budgets have ballooned to the point where a single mistake can jeopardize an entire studio. That financial pressure inevitably shapes creative choices. Systems become streamlined because complexity is expensive. Worlds become familiar because new settings are risky. Narrative follows tightly controlled funnels because branching storylines require enormous amounts of bespoke content. And player progression often stretches longer than it needs to be because retention metrics have become part of the design equation. And that doesn't mean Western games lack craftsmanship. They remain technically polished, narratively strong, and visually impressive, but you can feel the weight of the structure behind them. There's a sense that developers are working inside a narrow corridor of what is considered safe, proven, and marketable. That corridor has become increasingly predictable, and it shows across many genres. Action games that emphasize accessibility over mastery, open worlds designed as networks of guided tasks rather than systems to explore, and RPGs that treat role-playing primarily as a narrative choice rather than a mechanical one. Where Winds Meet arrives not as a challenger to a specific franchise, but as something that operates outside this corridor altogether. And that's where the discomfort begins. One of the clearest ways this difference appears is in the game's combat design. Western AAA combat has for many years now leaned towards systems that prioritize clarity and approachability. Encounters tend to follow predictable rhythms. Attacks are often animation locked to ensure readability, and builds frequently amount to selecting modifiers within a narrow band of intended playstyles. It's clean, it's functional, but it rarely evolves into something deeply personal. By contrast, Where Winds Meet approaches combat as a form of player expression. The game layers martial arts techniques, weapon styles, stances, and movement abilities in a way that encourages players to create their own rhythm rather than adopt a predetermined one. Parrying and deflection are integral to beating the game at the highest difficulties, and they require deliberate timing rather than generous windows. Aerial attacks flow naturally out of traversal abilities, and different combinations of techniques meaningfully alter how encounters unfold. The difference matters because it reveals a design attitude Western AAA studios have gradually moved away from: the willingness to let players create chaos, mastery, and identity through mechanics. As the cost of production increased, Western combat systems became more curated, more controlled, and more focused on ensuring consistency across the entire experience. Where Winds Meet shows what happens when a game is willing to be less restrictive and let players shape the style of combat rather than just simply operate within it. Traversal is another place where Western AAA studios have grown predictable. In many large open world games, movement is treated as a means to an end. You climb carefully marked surfaces, follow clearly designed routes, travel along terrain that is intentionally shaped to funnel you towards points of interest, or generic mounts that the players have no opportunity to build deep personal connections towards. The goal is often to reduce friction rather than to give movement its own sense of personality. Where Winds Meet offers a dramatically different philosophy, inspired by classic wuxia fiction. Movement is treated as a spectacle and a skill, something that reflects the fantastical nature of the characters rather than the constraints of the world. You transition naturally from sprinting across rooftops to running alongside of a cliff, or from scaling a fortress wall to gliding across an entire valley. All of these abilities are designed to integrate with exploration and combat, allowing the players to use mobility as a tool for problem solving rather than simply as transportation. This approach creates a sense of freedom that Western open worlds rarely attempt anymore. Instead of navigating a carefully manicured environment, you move through the world as if the laws of physics were suggestions. This used to be the case if you look back at games like Assassin's Creed and Just Cause, but nowadays you rarely see that anymore. It demonstrates how powerful Traversal can be when it isn't constantly limited by concerns about balance or sequence breaking. And it subtly exposes how risk-averse Western movement systems have become. Role-playing, in the Western AAA sense, has increasingly migrated towards authored narrative choices. Dialogue options, companion approval, and branching storylines have become the dominant expression of player agency. These systems can be effective, don't get me wrong, but they also reduce role-playing to the act of selecting a line of dialogue or choosing between a handful of predetermined outcomes. Where Winds Meet takes a more systemic approach by allowing players to adopt professions, moral alignments, social reputations, and behavioral tendencies that influence how the world responds towards them. Becoming a doctor, a constable, a traveling performer, or a wandering swordsman isn't just a thematic label. It alters the opportunities the world presents to you and the tone of the interactions with its inhabitants. A character aligned with righteous cultivation will be welcomed in ways demonic cultivators will not, and NPC reactions shift in ways that reflect the player's evolving identity. This creates a form of role-playing that is less about choosing from a menu and more about inhabiting a role within a living system. Western studios used to experiment more with this kind of design, but as projects grew larger and narrative expectations became more cinematic, systemic freedom became harder to sustain. Where Winds Meet demonstrates how refreshing it is when a game reintroduces those layers of identity, behavior, and consequence without relying solely on dialogue tree. Another area where the difference becomes impossible to avoid is in how Where Winds Meet positions itself economically. The game embraces a free-to-play structure focused primarily on cosmetics, not on content, yet it offers an experience with the scale and ambition of a large premium RPG. The single-player content is extensive, progression is spaced to support experimentation, and the absence of forced grinds allow the world to unfold naturally rather than through repetitive tasks designed to maximize playtime. That's actually what drew me towards Where Winds Meet so much, because I just wanted a nice single-player experience that I could occasionally play with my friends. Normally when my friends want to play an online game like an MMO, I have to spend hundreds of hours just grinding towards where they're at just to enjoy the same content as them. In Where Winds Meet, I have so much single-player content to enjoy before I even feel the need to play with my friends. While that is bad for socializing, it does make a hell of an experience. When players compare this to many full-priced Western releases, games that cost $70 up front and often include additional expansions, cosmetic shops, and seasonal content, that contrast becomes difficult to ignore. The question isn't whether one approach is morally superior, it's whether the Western pricing model is still aligned with the kind of experiences it provides. And by the way, it's definitely not morally superior, it's morally inferior in every sense of the word. Where Winds Meet pushes this tension into the spotlight, not by attacking Western practices directly, but simply by offering something more generous at a time when generosity is rare. One of the most striking things about Where Winds Meet is how confidently it leans into cultural specificity. The game embraces a historical period rarely explored in mainstream gaming and layers it with elements of Chinese philosophy, martial arts, literature, mythology, and aesthetics. It doesn't dilute these influences for global appeal. Instead, it presents them sincerely, trusting the players to want to engage with something different. The choices stand in contrast to many Western AAA titles, which often gravitate towards broadly familiar settings, European-inspired fantasy, post-apocalyptic survival, and Hollywood-style science fiction. These frameworks are popular for a reason, don't get me wrong, but their ubiquity has created a sense of sameness across the largest Western releases. Where Winds Meet introduces a perspective that feels distinct and confident, proving that cultural identity can be a creative advantage rather than a commercial risk, opening the way for many other studios from cultures and backgrounds that we've yet to see in mainstream gaming into the market. But don't let that confuse you. The fear surrounding Where Winds Meet isn't rooted in some sort of nationalism, rivalry, or even competition in the traditional sense. It comes from the realization that players still crave ambition, mechanical depth, and worlds that trust them to experiment, and that Western AAA has spent years moving away from those values in the pursuit of stability. By presenting an experience built around expressive combat, dynamic traversal, systemic role playing, and a generous value model, Where Winds Meet acts as a mirror held up to the Western AAA industry. It reflects the strengths that defined the genre a decade ago and highlights how far many studios have drifted from those ideals. And because it's free and accessible, it invites a much larger number of players to make those comparisons themselves. In the end, the true threat posed by Where Winds Meet isn't popularity or its production value, it's the standard it sets. It shows that an open world RPG can still be bold, mechanically rich, culturally specific, and player friendly without collapsing under the weight of its own ambition. It demonstrates that risk taking is not only possible, but rewarding, and it quietly exposes the constraints that Western studios have imposed on themselves. People have forgotten what ambitious RPGs feel like. They've simply been waiting for someone to remind them. And Where Winds Meet does exactly that, not by challenging the West directly, but by showing what happens when a studio builds with curiosity, with the players in mind, instead of caution and profit in mind.